It felt deliberate. But then she realized the night wasn't over.
She thought the hardest part of her night was already over, 12 hours on her feet. A smile forced through exhaustion. Then she saw the receipt. The bill was paid, but the tip was zero, not forgotten, not accidental. A choice. For a single mother barely holding her life together, it felt like a silent verdict. But just as she reached to clear the table, her fingers touched something that didn't belong there. Hidden, intentional, waiting to be found. What lay beneath that plate wasn't just a note. It was a message that would expose a truth far bigger than money and force the world to confront something it prefers to ignore. If this story already has you thinking, subscribe now. What comes next will make you see everything differently.
Life did not offer her pauses. It moved forward whether she was ready or not, dragging her along with responsibilities that never lightened. Every day began before the sun rose in a small apartment where the walls had learned to keep secrets. The alarm rang quietly so it wouldn't wake the child sleeping in the next room. She moved carefully, like someone who knew how fragile peace could be. Mornings were a race against time, packing lunches, checking homework, counting the last few dollars in her wallet before slipping them back into place and pretending they were enough. Being a single mother meant living in constant calculation. Every decision had weight, every expense carried consequences. There was no room for mistakes, no cushion for bad luck. The world expected strength from her without ever offering support in return. She had learned to carry exhaustion the same way she carried her purse, always present, always heavy, never put down. The diner was where she spent most of her waking hours. It wasn't just a job, it was the thin line between stability and collapse. The building itself looked tired, like it had seen too many people come and go without ever being remembered. The floors creaked. The booths were cracked and patched with duct tape. The air smelled permanently of coffee that had been reheated too many times. But it was honest work, and honest work was something she took pride in, even when the world treated it like it meant nothing. She knew the rhythm of the place better than her own heartbeat. She could tell who would tip well by how they avoided eye contact and who wouldn't by how loudly they spoke. She learned to read people quickly because time was not a luxury she had. Some customers treated her like she was invisible, others treated her like she was disposable. And then there were those who smiled politely while silently measuring her worth as if deciding whether she deserved respect or not. Racism in her life was rarely loud. It didn't always come with slurs or shouting. More often, it arrived quietly in lowered expectations, in suspicious looks, in the way people spoke slower around her as if she might not understand. It lived in assumptions made before she ever opened her mouth. It followed her into stores, offices, and workplaces. It was subtle enough to deny but strong enough to hurt. That night started like so many others. Her shift dragged on hour after hour as the diner slowly emptied. She had already worked a double earlier in the week, but overtime was never guaranteed and turning down a shift wasn't an option. Her feet throbbed with every step. Her back burned from leaning over tables all night. Still, she moved with purpose, reminding herself that every plate cleared brought her one step closer to home. When the man walked in, he stood out immediately, not because he demanded attention, but because he didn't have to. His presence carried authority, the kind that came from money, from never having to ask twice, from living in a world where doors opened without resistance. He dressed simply, but nothing about him was modest. His confidence filled the space long before he sat down. She treated him like every other customer, professional, polite, efficient. She didn't linger, she didn't oversell friendliness. She did her job exactly the way she was expected to. She took his order, delivered his food, refilled his glass. She made sure everything was right because mistakes, even small ones, were rarely forgiven people like her. As the minutes passed, she felt that familiar tension creep in. The awareness that she was being observed, evaluated, judged. It wasn't something she could explain easily. It was a feeling learned through experience, a sense that her actions were being measured against an invisible standard she could never fully meet. The diner was quiet by then, the kind of quiet that made time feel stretched and uncomfortable. Outside, the city moved on without her. Inside, she counted minutes and dollars in her head, calculating what the night might bring. Tips determined whether groceries would last the week, whether the lights would stay on, whether she could breathe a little easier or spend the next few days worrying. When he finished his meal, there was no acknowledgement, no nod. No sign that she had been noticed at all. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the door without hesitation. It was an ordinary moment, one she had seen countless times before. Customers came and went. That was the job. She approached the table expecting routine. Dishes to clear, surfaces to wipe. Another small chapter closed in a day full of them. Then she saw the receipt. The bill was paid in full, every item accounted for, and beneath it, written clearly and deliberately, was a zero, not a blank space, not a rushed oversight. A zero placed with intention. Her chest tightened. For a moment, she felt heat rise behind her eyes, but she forced it down. She had learned how to swallow disappointment quickly. The diner didn't stop for personal moments. Still, this one lingered. Not because of the money alone, but because of what it represented. She replayed the night in her head, searching for mistakes, looking for reasons. There were none. The service had been flawless. And deep down, she already knew the truth she didn't want to admit. This wasn't about performance. It was about perception. She had experienced this before, but rarely so bluntly, the feeling of being punished for existing. The quiet reminder that effort did not guarantee fairness, that some people walked through life with the power to dismiss others without consequence. The zero stared back at her like confirmation of everything she had learned to expect but never accepted. Around her, the diner carried on in soft noises and small movements, unaware that something inside her had shifted. This moment didn't explode, it settled, heavy and unmistakable. She felt smaller standing there, not because she lacked strength, but because the world had once again reminded her how easily her labor could be erased. She stayed where she was for a second longer than necessary, grounding herself, forcing her breath steady, reminding herself that survival sometimes meant absorbing the blow and continuing forward. As she reached to clear the plate, her fingers brushed against something unexpected. Paper, folded neatly, hidden where no one else would think to look. Her heart skipped. Notes left behind were never kind. They were often smug, instructive, or cruel in ways that pretended to be helpful. She hesitated. The moment stretched. Around her, the diner carried on as if nothing had changed. No one noticed the shift happening inside her. Slowly, she unfolded the paper. The words hit harder than the zero ever could. They were deliberate, thought out, not rushed or careless. This wasn't written in anger, it was written with certainty. The message stripped away any remaining doubt about intent. The tip wasn't missing, it was withheld, on purpose. The note made that clear. Her hands trembled slightly as the meaning settled in. This wasn't just disrespect. It was a reminder of power, a declaration of superiority wrapped in casual cruelty. Someone with everything had decided to leave her with nothing, not just financially but emotionally. Her stomach dropped as memories surfaced. Other moments, other nights, other quiet humiliations she had brushed aside to keep going. The pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't isolated, it was systemic, and now it was documented. She folded the note slowly and slipped it into her pocket, her pulse pounding in her ears. The man was gone. He had left without looking back, free from the weight he had placed on her. That, too, felt familiar. Accountability was a luxury rarely afforded to people like her. As she finished her shift, the diner felt different, smaller, louder, every sound sharper than before. She moved through her tasks on autopilot, her mind replaying the note again and again. Each time it burned deeper, plates clinked. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. The hum of the lights felt unbearable. Nothing about the space had changed, yet everything felt wrong. She completed her work the same way she always did, methodical, efficient, quiet, but her body moved while her thoughts remained locked on the folded paper in her pocket. The weight of it pressed against her with every step. It reminded her that what had happened could not be undone, unseen, or dismissed. By the time she stepped outside into the cool night air, exhaustion had been replaced by something else. A quiet resolve she hadn't felt before. She didn't know what she would do next. She only knew she couldn't pretend this hadn't happened. What began as another long shift had turned into something far heavier. A moment that refused to be dismissed. A truth that demanded acknowledgement. And as she walked home under flickering streetlights, one thought echoed louder than all the rest: this was no longer just her burden to carry alone. The city around her continued without pause. Cars passed, windows glowed, people moved through their lives unaware that something irreversible had just settled into hers. She held herself together as she walked, shoulders squared, steps steady, even as her chest felt tight with everything she had not allowed herself to feel inside the diner. The night air filled her lungs, grounding her, but it did not lift the weight. It only confirmed that the moment was real, that it had happened, and that she was carrying it forward whether she wanted to or not. She barely slept that night. The note stayed in her pocket even after she changed clothes, even after she lay down in the dark. It felt wrong to put it anywhere else, as if setting it down would make it disappear. Her mind replayed the moment again and again, the receipt, the zero, the folded paper hidden beneath the plate. Every time she closed her eyes, the words resurfaced, sharp and unmistakable. They carried intent. They carried certainty. Morning came too quickly. The apartment filled with the soft sounds of routine, water running, a child stirring, the hum of a day that demanded attention no matter how heavy her heart felt. She moved through the motions automatically, her body present while her thoughts remained somewhere else. She looked at her child and felt a surge of determination mixed with fear. Everything she did was for this life she was responsible for protecting. And now that responsibility felt more fragile than ever. She thought about forgetting the note, about throwing it away and moving on like she always had. That was the safest path, the expected path. Silence had always been the price of stability. But this time, silence felt like surrender. The words on that paper weren't just about her. They reflected something larger, something that had shaped her entire life without ever being named so plainly. She could feel the tension between survival and truth tightening with every passing hour. The note was no longer just an object. It had become a question she could not ignore, a line she had already crossed simply by seeing it. And now, no matter what she chose, she understood that something had already changed. At work, the diner buzzed with its usual rhythm, but she felt out of sync with it. Every interaction felt heavier, every glance loaded with meaning. She wondered how many people around her carried stories like hers, tucked away and unspoken. How many moments like that one went unnoticed because no one dared to speak them aloud. The note became a line she couldn't step back over. It demanded acknowledgement, and slowly, carefully, she began to share what had happened. Not loudly. Not publicly, just enough to test the air. The reaction was immediate and unsettling. Some listened with quiet understanding. Others responded with doubt, their faces tightening as if the story made them uncomfortable. The questions came quickly. What exactly had she done? Was there a misunderstanding? Was she sure she hadn't misread the situation? Each question felt like another layer of weight added to her shoulders. The focus shifted, subtly but unmistakably, away from the act itself and onto her behavior. The familiar pattern revealed itself once again. The burden of proof rested on the one who had been harmed. She felt the pressure to soften the story, to make it more palatable, to explain away the cruelty so others wouldn't have to confront it, but the note didn't allow for softening. Its meaning was clear, its intent undeniable. And the more she tried to carry it quietly, the heavier it became. The diner no longer felt neutral. It felt charged, as though every corner held judgment she could not escape. She moved through her shifts aware that eyes lingered longer than before. Soon, the story moved beyond her immediate circle. It spread in fragments, reshaped by the people who told it. Some treated it as an example of injustice. Others dismissed it as exaggeration. The man behind the note remained distant and untouched, his identity protected by status and influence. Meanwhile, she felt increasingly exposed. The diner no longer felt like a refuge. Whispers followed her. Not always hostile, but rarely supportive. People watched her more closely, as if waiting for a mistake that would validate their doubts. The atmosphere shifted from routine to scrutiny, and with scrutiny came fear. She worried about retaliation, about losing hours, about being labeled difficult. In her world, standing up often came with consequences that were never written down but always enforced. She had seen it happen to others. People quietly pushed out, schedules changed, opportunities disappeared without explanation. At home, the weight followed her. She found herself staring at the note late at night, tracing the folds with her fingers. She wondered how someone could be so deliberate in their cruelty and walk away unaffected. How wealth could insulate people from accountability. How easily dignity could be reduced to a lesson delivered without consequence. The silence of her apartment amplified every thought. The walls that once felt protective now felt too close. The night stretched long as she sat with questions that had no immediate answers, only consequences. Her anger grew, but it was not wild or explosive. It was controlled, focused, and exhausting. It settled into her bones and refused to leave. She felt it in every interaction, every forced smile, every moment she swallowed words she wanted to say. Then came the turning point she hadn't expected. The story reached people who recognized it immediately, not because they knew her but because they had lived it. Messages of solidarity began to appear, quiet acknowledgments from strangers who had endured similar moments. Each message carried the same theme: this had happened to them too. The realization was overwhelming. Her experience was not isolated. It was part of a pattern woven so deeply into everyday life that many had learned to accept it as normal. The note was not an anomaly, it was a symptom. That understanding brought both comfort and fear. Comfort in knowing she wasn't alone, fear in realizing how vast the problem truly was. Speaking up now felt even more dangerous, but remaining silent felt impossible. She stood in that tension, caught between the instinct to protect herself and the growing certainty that silence would only allow the pattern to continue. And in that reflection, literal and emotional, she began to understand that the story had already moved beyond her control. As the story gained traction, resistance grew alongside support. People questioned motives, they reframed the narrative, they accused her of seeking attention or playing the victim. The cruelty shifted forms, becoming less visible but no less damaging. Racism, she learned, did not need to be loud to be effective. It only needed enough people willing to doubt. The pressure mounted. She felt trapped between survival and truth, between protecting her livelihood and honoring her dignity. The world seemed to demand that she choose one, and still, the man who had started it all remained absent from the consequences. His life continued uninterrupted. His power ensured distance. The imbalance was stark and infuriating. One action, one note had upended her life while leaving his untouched. There were moments when fear nearly won. When she considered stepping back, letting the story fade, reclaiming some sense of normalcy, but each time she thought of her child, of the example she was setting, of the world she was preparing them to face. She realized that silence would teach acceptance. Speaking up, even imperfectly, taught resistance. The tension reached a breaking point when the full meaning of the note could no longer be denied. When enough people saw it not as an isolated incident but as a reflection of a deeper truth, the discomfort spread, conversations grew louder, denial became harder to maintain. She stood at the center of it all, exhausted and exposed but no longer unsure. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. What had begun as a hidden message beneath a plate had grown into something impossible to ignore. And as the pressure continued to build, one thing became clear: this story was no longer just about what had been taken from her. It was about what she was no longer willing to give up. The moment everything shifted did not arrive with a single explosion. It arrived in waves, relentless and overwhelming, crashing into every part of her life until there was nowhere left to stand without feeling the force of it. What had once been a private wound was now fully exposed, and with exposure came judgment, distortion, and pressure she had never been prepared for. Her name began to circulate in spaces she had never entered. Not because she sought attention, but because the story demanded a center and the world had chosen her. People spoke about her without knowing her. They debated her worth, her intentions, her credibility, as if her life were an abstract idea instead of something fragile and real. Each retelling stripped away context and replaced it with speculation. The note, once folded quietly in her pocket, became the focal point of everything. Some called it proof, others dismissed it as meaningless. The same piece of paper carried two entirely different truths, depending on who was looking at it. And that contradiction cut deeper than the original insult, because it revealed how easily injustice could be questioned away when acknowledging it became inconvenient. The pressure intensified when consequences began to surface, not for the man who wrote the note but for her, subtle at first: a shift in how she was treated, Fewer hours, colder interactions, the unspoken message was clear. Visibility came at a cost. Speaking up had marked her, and marks were rarely worn safely by people like her. Fear took on a new shape. It was no longer just about money or stability. It was about safety, about reputation, about being labeled a problem rather than a person. She felt watched in ways she never had before. Every action scrutinized, every reaction measured against expectations she had no part in creating, and still, the man remained untouched. His absence was deafening. He did not apologize, he did not explain, he did not acknowledge. His silence was powerful because it did not need to be broken. The system worked in his favor without effort. His wealth and status wrapped him in insulation so thick that the truth could not penetrate it. That imbalance became impossible to ignore. The climax came not from a confrontation, but from a realization so heavy it nearly brought her to her knees. This was not about a single act of cruelty. It was about how easily the world protected those with power and punished those without it. How suffering became negotiable when it belonged to the marginalized. How dignity could be debated as if it were optional. She felt anger rise like a fire she could no longer contain, not explosive but consuming. It burned through her exhaustion, through her fear, through the instinct to shrink herself for survival. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had been done to her and what had been done to so many before her. She thought of her mother, of stories passed down quietly, wrapped in warnings instead of hope. She thought of every moment she had been told to work harder, smile more, complain less. Every time she had been taught that endurance was strength and silence was safety. Standing in the middle of this storm, she understood how those lessons had been used to keep people like her in place. The realization was devastating and freeing, because once she saw the pattern clearly, she could no longer pretend it was accidental. She could no longer internalize blame that did not belong to her. The shame she had been taught to carry began to lift, replaced by something far more dangerous to the status quo: clarity. The backlash grew louder as clarity spread. Some doubled down on denial. Others became defensive, offended by the implication that they might be complicit. The conversation shifted from empathy to argument, from understanding to control. People demanded neat endings and comfortable explanations, neither of which existed. She felt isolated in ways she never had before. Support came, but it was inconsistent, fragile, easily drowned out by doubt. The emotional toll was relentless. There were moments she questioned whether the truth was worth the damage it caused to her life. Moments when the desire to disappear felt stronger than the desire to be seen. But then she remembered the note. Not the paper itself, but what it represented. The confidence with which someone had reduced her humanity to a lesson, the casual cruelty of it, the knowledge that if she remained silent, nothing would change. That another person would stand where she had stood, feel what she had felt, and be told to endure it quietly. That knowledge hardened her resolve. The climax reached its peak when the story could no longer be controlled. When enough people recognized it not as an isolated incident but as a reflection of a deeper, systemic truth. The discomfort spread beyond her, forcing institutions, communities, and individuals to confront questions they had long avoided. This was the moment of no return. She realized that even if the outcome cost her stability, even if it changed her life permanently, the truth had already done its work. It had exposed something raw and undeniable. It had disrupted the comfort of ignorance, and that disruption mattered. The fear did not disappear. It sat beside her courage, heavy and constant, but it no longer dictated her actions. She understood now that survival without dignity was another form of loss, and dignity demanded risk. As the pressure reached its highest point, as narratives clashed and consequences loomed, she stood grounded in one unshakable truth. What happened to her was real, and it mattered. The story had outgrown her control. It had become a mirror held up to society, reflecting not just one act of racism, but the countless ways it was excused, minimized, and sustained. And as the world grappled with what it saw in that reflection, one question lingered with crushing weight. When truth finally stands in plain sight, who will be brave enough to face it, and who will look away? The aftermath did not arrive with relief. It arrived quietly, settling into her life like a permanent shadow. When the attention faded and the noise moved elsewhere, she was left standing in the same world, but changed in ways no one else could fully see. There was no triumphant ending, no sudden justice that restored what had been taken. Instead, there was reality unfolding slowly and unevenly. The diner still opened every morning, coffee still brewed, orders were still taken and cleared away. On the surface, nothing looked different, but beneath that routine lived the impact of everything that had happened. She moved through her shifts with the same efficiency, the same discipline, yet something inside her had shifted forever. She no longer carried the illusion that effort alone could protect her. That belief had been taken from her the moment she unfolded that note. There were losses, some obvious, others subtle, hours that never returned, opportunities that quietly disappeared, relationships that cooled without explanation. No one ever said it was because she spoke up. They didn't have to, the message was clear enough. Visibility had consequences, truth came with a price. But there were gains too, though they were harder to measure. She gained clarity, the kind that strips away self-blame and replaces it with understanding. For the first time, she stopped asking herself what she could have done differently. She stopped replaying the night in search of imaginary mistakes. The responsibility was no longer hers to carry. She learned that racism did not always arrive as violence. Sometimes it arrived neatly folded, hidden beneath a plate, delivered by someone who would never have to explain themselves. Sometimes it hid behind money, manners, and silence. And sometimes the most painful part was not the act itself, but how easily it was dismissed by those who did not want to see it. At home, she held her child a little closer. The future felt uncertain, but her resolve felt stronger. She knew she could not shield them from the world entirely, but she could teach them truth. She could teach them that dignity was not something to be earned through obedience or silence. It was something inherent, something worth defending. The story lived on in quieter ways, in conversations sparked late at night, in moments of recognition between strangers who shared similar experiences, in the discomfort it created for those who had never been forced to confront these realities before. It did not fix the system, but it disrupted it, even if only briefly. She understood now that racism survived not only through cruelty but through indifference, through people who preferred comfort over accountability, through systems designed to protect power and question pain. And she understood how often the burden of education was placed on those already harmed. There were days when exhaustion threatened to undo her, when she wondered if speaking up had been worth the cost, when the weight of responsibility felt unbearable. But each time doubt crept in, she remembered why silence had never protected her in the first place. It had only postponed the pain. What happened to her was not unique. That truth lingered more heavily than anything else. Somewhere else, another person was standing at a table, holding a receipt, feeling the same quiet humiliation. Somewhere else, someone was being taught once again that their humanity was conditional. Her story did not end with closure in the traditional sense. There was no apology that erased the harm, no punishment that balanced the scales. But there was impact, there was awareness, there was a crack in the silence that had existed before. And sometimes that is how change begins, not with grand gestures but with uncomfortable truths brought into the light. With moments that force reflection instead of denial, with stories that refuse to disappear quietly. She continued living, working, providing, loving, but she did so with a deeper understanding of the world she was navigating. She was no longer naive about its fairness, but she was also no longer willing to accept its injustices without question. Her dignity remained intact, not because the world granted it, but because she claimed it. This story is not about a tip. It never was. It is about how power is used, about who is believed, about who is expected to endure quietly so others can remain comfortable. It is about the everyday moments where racism reveals itself without raising its voice. And now, it is about you, because stories like this only matter if they change how we see the world. If they make us pause before dismissing someone else's pain, if they challenge us to speak when silence feels easier. The truth was placed in front of her that night, hidden beneath a plate. The question is, when truth is placed in front of us clearly and undeniably, what will we choose to do with it? Will we look away, or will we finally choose to see?